The mountain had been trying to tell them something for 40 years. Nobody listened. That was the thing about mountains. They spoke in a language that required patience to learn, and patience was not a commodity that flourished in a mining settlement in western Montana in the autumn of 1912, where the days were short and the work was hard, and the winter was always closer than you wanted it to be. Maren Holt had been learning the mountains language for 3 years. She was 64 years old that September, a widow with white hair she kept pinned back without vanity, and hands that showed every year of the work she had asked of them. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing in any way that strangers noticed immediately. What strangers noticed, if they paid attention past the first impression, was the quality of her attention, the way she looked at things. Not glanced, looked. With the specific focus of someone who had learned at considerable cost that the difference between seeing and not seeing was the difference between life and death. She had learned this on a January morning 3 years before, standing on the bank of the river that ran along the eastern edge of Alder Creek. Callum had been lacing his boots at the kitchen table when she came back from the river that morning. The logging crew was moving timber across the ice that day, the same crossing they had made a dozen times through the winter, and something about the ice had been bothering Maren since before dawn. She had walked down to the bank while the sky was still dark and the settlement was still sleeping, and she had done what she always did when something bothered her. She had gotten close enough to look at it properly. She knelt on the bank and pressed her palm flat against the surface of the ice. What she felt was not dramatic. It was subtle, the kind of thing you would miss if you were moving too fast or thinking about something else. A faint vibration beneath her hand, almost imperceptible. The kind of pulse that meant the water underneath was running faster than it should have been running in the middle of January. She moved her hand and pressed again in a different spot and felt the same thing. Then she straightened and looked toward the far bank, and in the gray pre-dawn light, she saw a hairline fracture running diagonally across the ice from a point about 20 yards out toward the bank on the far side. You had to know what you were looking for. You had to be close enough. You had to be paying the right kind of attention. She went back to the cabin and told Callum. He was a good man. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own private accounting, even in the moments when the memory of what happened next was the hardest to hold. He was a good man with a good man's confidence, and he had crossed that river on that ice 20 times in the past 2 winters, and he was not the kind of man who could look at his wife's worried face and feel anything except fond reassurance. He smiled. He said the ice was thick enough to hold a team of horses. He said she worried too much. He kissed her forehead with the easy warmth of a man who fully expects to be home before supper, and he picked up his coat and went out the door. 4 hours later, the ice opened. They pulled Callum's body from the water downstream 2 days later. Maren buried him on the hillside above town in a rocky high place he had once said he liked for the view. She chose it partly for that reason, and partly because she understood, standing at the grave in the January cold, that she was never going to stop thinking about the hairline fracture she had seen that morning, and she wanted to be able to see the river from where she buried him. She made herself a promise at that grave. She was not going to ignore another warning because nobody else could see it. She was not going to trust the easy answer when the careful answer might save a life. She was not going to let someone else's confidence, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how warmly offered, overrule what her own eyes were telling her. That promise was the beginning of everything that followed. It started with the ground. In the months after Callum died, Maren began paying attention to the mountain the way she had learned to pay attention to ice. Close, patient, looking for the things that were there only if you knew to look for them. She had always been observant, the way people are observant when they have spent their lives doing work that requires precision and cannot afford mistakes. She had learned carpentry from her father and then learned it more thoroughly in the years of her marriage, when there was always something in the cabin that needed building or repairing, and Callum was better with metal than with wood. She understood how materials behaved under stress. She understood how things failed. She began looking at the mountain the same way she looked at a beam before she trusted it with weight. What she found was in the ground itself. The first thing she noticed was the gravel. Alder Creek sat in a narrow valley between steep ridges, and the valley floor was what you would expect: rich, dark soil, good for growing things, carrying the alluvial deposits that rivers leave behind over centuries. But on the lower slopes of the north-facing ridge, if you knelt and scraped away the thin layer of topsoil, you found something different. Dense packed gravel compressed with a force that soil and water alone could not account for. The kind of compaction that required enormous weight moving at significant speed. She found the stumps next. They were old, rotted down to ground level, in most cases barely recognizable as stumps at all, unless you were specifically looking for them or wanted them. But they were there scattered across the lower slope in a pattern that wasn't random. Broken, bent, pushed over, and all of them pointing in the same direction. Down the slope and toward the valley floor. They had not been pushed by wind. Wind pushed in different directions and wind left different marks. These stumps had been pushed by something that came from above and moved straight down and carried everything in its path. Marin walked the slope many times over the following year. She mapped what she found in a small notebook, the gravel layer's extent, the stump locations, the places where the creek bank curved in ways the water alone couldn't have carved. She consulted the oldest book she could find at the settlement's small lending library, a geological survey from the territorial period that had a chapter on mountain snowpack and the conditions that produced what it called snow avalanches. She read that chapter 6 times. What she understood by the spring of 1912 was this something enormous had moved through the valley where Alder Creek now stood approximately 30 to 40 years earlier, before the settlement existed. The evidence was consistent with a major avalanche. The slope above the valley, steep north-facing collecting snow in the deep gullies that funneled toward the cliffs, was the kind of terrain the survey described as high risk. Not every winter, perhaps not most winters. But given the right conditions, given snow of the right weight and moisture content sitting on ice, the right temperature, the mountain above Alder Creek could move. And if it moved, it would come straight through the valley floor. She went to Harrick Dunn in July of 1912. Harrick owned the only general store within 30 miles of Alder Creek, which meant he was, in the practical arithmetic of a remote settlement, the most powerful man in the valley. Not elected, not appointed, simply indispensable, in the way that a man becomes indispensable when he controls the flour and the nails and the medicine and the lamp oil, when the nearest alternative is a day's ride in good weather and an impossibility in bad. He was 62 years old and had been in Alder Creek long enough to have strong opinions about how things worked and a vested interest in those opinions being correct. Marin laid her evidence on the counter of his store on a Tuesday afternoon in July, when the mountain above them was green and the sky was clear, and the idea of a catastrophic avalanche was as abstract as anything she had ever tried to make real for another person. She showed him the notebook. She explained the gravel layer, the stump pattern, the curve of the creek bank. She described what the geological survey said about north-facing slopes and snow accumulation. She was precise because she had learned that precision was what separated a warning from a worry, and she needed him to hear a warning. Harrick listened. He was a man who prided himself on being reasonable, and he listened with the patient expression of someone who is waiting for the part that changes their mind. That part didn't come in his assessment. He told her he appreciated her concern. He told her the valley had been here longer than the settlement, and if an avalanche had come through once, it didn't necessarily mean another was coming. He told her that the men who worked the mines depended on this valley, that their families depended on this valley, and that spreading fear about a danger that might never materialize would damage things that couldn't be easily repaired. He said this gently. He said it with genuine care for the community he was part of. Then he told her to put the notebook away and go home and let the matter rest. She put the notebook away. She did not let the matter rest. She bought the plot of land on the hillside in September with every dollar she had saved in the 3 years since Callum died. It was not a lot of money, but it was all of it, and the plot was not prime real estate. Steep exposed the kind of ground that no one in Alder Creek wanted because it made every chore harder and offered no advantages that anyone could see. She paid the price that was asked without negotiating because she did not have time for negotiation and because the price was fair. She began building the following week. The settlement noticed within days. It was not possible to haul lumber up a narrow hillside trail without being seen, and Marin was not trying to hide what she was doing. She worked alone from dawn to failing light, carrying what she could carry, and devising rigs and pulleys for what she couldn't. The work was hard in the way that purposeful work is hard, not defeating, but consuming, demanding her full attention, and rewarding that attention with measurable progress at the end of each day. The reactions from below were predictable. Boyd Calder was the first to come up and look. He was the settlement's blacksmith, a practical man of 55 who had spent his adult life working with metal and understood structures in the intuitive way of someone who builds things for a living. He climbed the trail one October afternoon and leaned against the unfinished wall and studied what Marin was doing with the focused attention of a craftsman evaluating unfamiliar work. He saw the depth of the foundation. He saw the stone back wall built directly against the slope, twice the thickness of a normal cabin wall. He saw the angle of the roof beams and the diagonal bracing that ran into the stone. He saw that the back of the structure was being set into the hillside rather than placed on top of it. He stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he said she was burying half the cabin in dirt, stone, she said, without looking up from the mortaring she was doing. She was pressing the mixture into the gaps in the back wall with her fingers packing it in by hand, because that was the only way to do it properly. Boyd said it still didn't make sense. He pointed at the valley below. Everyone built down there for a reason. Marin wiped her hands on her work apron. Everyone builds where it's easy, she said. Boyd chuckled. He nodded toward the hillside wall. But why build against the mountain? She looked at him. Because mountains don't move, she said. At least not by themselves. He didn't understand that yet. He would. She walked to the edge of the ridge and knelt and swept the thin topsoil away with her hand, and the gravel layer appeared dense, pale, compressed. She let him look at it for a moment. Then she pointed up toward the steep cliffs that rose above the valley and explained what she had found and what it meant. Boyd looked at the gravel for a long time. Then he looked at the slope above. Then he shook his head and went back down the trail. And that evening he told the story at Harwick's store, and by the next morning the whole settlement had heard the theory and had decided what to think about it. What they decided to think was that Marin Holt had not been entirely right in the head since her husband drowned. Harwick Dunn climbed the trail himself 2 weeks after Boyd's visit. He came in the afternoon when the light was good and Marin was working on the roof beams, and he stood at the edge of the cleared ground and watched her for a moment before he spoke. Then he said what he had come to say, which was what he always said when something threatened to disrupt the economy of the valley that his store depended on. He did not deny that she might be right about the danger. That surprised her, and she stopped working and looked at him because she had not expected that. What he said was that it didn't matter whether she was right if the effect of saying so was panic. If the miners believed there was a real risk of an avalanche, they would leave. Their families would leave. And if Alder Creek shrank, it shrank back toward nothing, and the store that served it shrank with it. He had built something here. He had invested in something here. A woman with a notebook full of observations about old gravel and broken tree stumps was not going to unmake what he had built. He said all of this without malice. He was not a villain in his own understanding of himself, and he was not wrong that fear could damage a community as surely as any physical disaster. He was simply a man who had calculated what mattered and had concluded that his calculation was more important than hers. Marin looked at him for a long moment after he finished. She was 64 years old, and she had buried her husband, and she had been talking to people who didn't want to listen for 3 years. And she knew, looking at Harwick Dunn standing at the edge of her building site in his clean coat, that this conversation was not going to change anything. She went back to work. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say that she had not already said in July and that he had not already decided to disregard. Harwick climbed back down the trail. The following Monday, she walked into his store to buy nails and hinges and a coil of heavy wire. The shelves behind Harwick's counter held everything she needed clearly visible. He told her he was fresh out of nails, out of hinges. The wire he expected a shipment of sometime next month, maybe the month after. She looked at what was on the shelves. She looked at him. She understood. She turned and walked out without a word, and she climbed the trail back to the hillside with her empty pack and her jaw set in a way that meant she had already moved past anger into something quieter and more durable. The night that changed things came 3 weeks later. She had been working late finishing a section of the cellar wall by lantern light when she heard the soft knock at the unfinished door. She was not expecting anyone. No one in Alder Creek had come to the cabin on the hill except Boyd, who had come once out of curiosity and not returned. She opened the door. Nettie Crane stood on the step in the dark small and still holding a canvas bag in both hands. She was 36 years old, the wife of a miner who worked for a man closely connected to Harwick Dunn's business interests. She had 2 young children and a life that required her husband's employment to continue, and her husband's employment required not making trouble. She was the last person in Alder Creek that Maren would have expected to see on her doorstep at night. Nettie held out the bag. Inside were nails, hinges, and a coil of wire. All of it purchased before Harwick's directive had gone out, she said in a voice barely above a whisper. She glanced once down the dark trail behind her. Don't tell anyone, she said. Maren took the bag. She looked at Nettie in the lantern light for a moment. Thank you, she said. Nettie turned and disappeared down the trail before Maren could say anything else. Maren stood in the doorway holding the bag and looking at the darkness where Nettie had been. Soot pressed against her leg. His gray muzzle warmed through the fabric of her work trousers. She had not cried since the week after Callum died. She did not cry now, but she stood there for a long time. The Sunday after Nettie's visit, Reverend Amos Veitch delivered a sermon that everyone in Alder Creek understood was about Maren Holt without her name ever being spoken. He was a careful man with words Veitch, tall and thin, with a voice that carried without effort and a habit of looking at the ceiling when he was building toward a point. He spoke about the sin of pride. He spoke about the arrogance of those who separate themselves from their community because they believe themselves to possess a wisdom that others lack. He spoke about tower builders who climb above their neighbors, not to serve them, but to look down upon them. He did not look at Maren in the last pew. He didn't need to. Every other pair of eyes in the church wanted to and didn't. Maren sat through all of it. When the sermon ended, the congregation stirred in the particular way of people preparing to stand and begin their Sunday conversations, and in that moment of transition, Maren stood up. The stirring stopped. She did not raise her voice. The church was small enough that she didn't need to. She said she had not built on the hillside because she thought she was smarter than anyone in that room. She said she had built there because 3 years ago in January she had knelt on the riverbank before dawn and pressed her hand to the ice and felt something that told her the ice was wrong, and she had gone home and told her husband, and he had smiled and kissed her forehead and walked out the door, and 4 hours later he was under the river. She said she was not afraid of being wrong. She said she was afraid of being right and having said nothing. Then she walked to the door and opened it and went out, and her boots on the wooden floor of the church were the only sound in the room. The trail up the hillside was steep in the autumn cold, and she climbed it with her back straight and her pace steady the way she always climbed it. She reached the cabin and sat on the unfinished step outside the door and looked out at the valley below, the lights of the settlement beginning to show in the early dark, the ridge lines on either side black against the last color in the sky. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, not from anger, from something deeper and older and harder to name, the specific trembling of someone who has said the true thing out loud to the people who needed to hear it and has no way of knowing yet whether it will matter. Soot came and pressed his muzzle against her knee. She put her hand on his head. She sat there until the last light left the sky and the stars came out over the valley, the same stars that had been above this mountain for longer than anyone who lived under them could imagine, patient and indifferent and cold. Tomorrow she would continue building. She had a cellar to finish and shelves to build and a winter coming that would not wait for anyone to be ready. She went inside and picked up her tools and got back to work. The cabin was finished on the 4th day of November. Maren stood outside it in the early morning and looked at what she had built the way she always looked at finished work, not with pride exactly, but with the specific attention of someone checking whether a thing was what it needed to be. She had been building things her whole adult life, and she had learned that the moment of completion was the moment to look most carefully, because you couldn't go back and fix what you didn't see. What she saw satisfied her. From below, from the valley floor where the settlement went about its business, the cabin was nearly invisible. The roof followed the angle of the slope so closely that from certain positions it looked like a natural fold in the hillside. The stone back wall had disappeared into the earth. Only the 2 front windows in the chimney faced outward toward the valley, and the ridge above them partially shielded even those. A person looking up from Alder Creek would have to know exactly where to look to see anything at all. Inside, the structure was different from what it appeared. The cellar ran 8 feet deep into the hillside with stone walls and a packed earth floor and wooden shelves along every surface. It stayed cool without ice in summer, and the stone held enough residual heat to stay above freezing in winter, and it was larger than it looked from outside, large enough to hold a serious quantity of preserved food. the kind of quantity that a person who was preparing for a long siege rather than an ordinary winter might accumulate over the remaining weeks of autumn. Marin began accumulating. She did it methodically the way she did everything. Barrels of dried beans on the lower shelves, the weight distributed evenly so the wood wouldn't bow. Bags of flour wrapped in oilcloth against moisture. Salt pork in clay crocks sealed with fat. Dried apples she had sliced herself in the late summer and hung from strings in the morning sun until they were leathery and dense with concentrated sweetness. Potatoes in a ventilated crate in the coolest corner. A supply of lamp oil. Candles. A medical kit that she had assembled over several months by purchasing individual items from the next settlement's doctor on her trips east for supplies that Harwick's store would no longer provide her. She did not tell anyone what she was doing or why. There was no point. She had told them what she believed was coming. They had made their decision about what to think of that belief. What she could do now was what she had always been able to do: prepare, build, stock the shelves, keep the fire going. Be ready for the thing that was coming, whether anyone believed in it or not. The settlement below her went about its autumn business. The miners worked their shifts and came home in the evenings to their families. The women kept their households and tended their gardens against the coming frost and visited with each other in the comfortable way of people who have built a community and believe in its permanence. Children ran between the buildings in the last good weather. Harwick's store had its regular traffic, and Reverend VH held his Sunday services, and Boyd Calder's hammer rang in the blacksmith shop through the working hours of every weekday. The settlement was by every visible measure a functioning community with a future. Marin watched it from her hillside with a feeling that was not contempt and not despair, but something more complicated than either a kind of grieving attention, the feeling of someone who loves a thing and cannot protect it from itself. Christmas came cold and clear. The celebration happened as it always did at Harwick Dunn's store, which was the largest interior space in the settlement and the natural gathering place for any occasion that required the community to occupy the same room. Harwick provided whiskey from behind the counter, and his wife provided food, and the miners brought their families, and for a few hours the store smelled of pine resin and candle wax and the particular warmth of many people in a small space. Boyd Calder stood near the stove with a glass in his hand and told the story of the mole woman, as they had been calling Marin for the past 2 months, the woman up on the hill who had buried her house in the mountain like an animal going underground. He had a good storyteller's instinct for the comic details, and the room laughed at the right moments, and Harwick laughed loudest of all, the laugh of a man who has been vindicated by the passage of time without incident. By the window at the edge of the gathering, Nettie Crane stood with a cup of cider she had barely touched. Her husband was talking with other miners across the room. Her children were near the door with the other children. She was looking out the window at the hillside where the settlement's lights did not reach, but where she knew if she looked for it, she could find the thin curl of smoke from the chimney of the cabin on the ridge. She found it. It rose straight in the still air, steady, and even the smoke of a fire well managed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Nettie sipped her cider and said nothing. The first day of the big storm arrived in the second week of January. It did not announce itself dramatically. It came the way the worst things often come, gradually, incrementally, each hour slightly worse than the one before, so that at no individual moment could you point to the clear threshold where ordinary winter became something different. The sky simply closed gray to white to gray again, and the snow began, and the snow did not stop. By the second night, the character of it had become clear. This was not the dry powder snow that the Montana winters usually delivered, the light crystals that children caught on their tongues and that brushed from a coat sleeve with a single sweep. This snow was heavy and wet, the kind that clung to everything it touched and built up mass with every hour. Tree branches that had stood through 20 winters bent low under the accumulation, and through the second night and into the third day, they began to fail. Not bending and recovering, but snapping, the sound of it carrying through the forest like the report of distant guns, random and sharp in the white silence. By the third day, the drifts had reached the fence posts. By the fourth, the road leading out of Alder Creek was buried under a wall that rose higher than a man's shoulders. Inside every cabin in the settlement, life contracted around the fireplace and the lamp. People shoveled their doorways in the morning and watched the snow fill them again by afternoon. The rooftops groaned in the evenings with sounds that were new and not entirely reassuring. Low wooden protests, the sounds of structures being asked to carry more than they had been designed to carry. But people managed because that was what people did. On the morning of the fourth day, Boyd Calder was outside shoveling the path between his smithy and his cabin when he stopped working and looked up at the mountains. He stood there for a moment. The upper ridge was visible above the cloud cover, white and severe in the flat light. He looked at the cliff face that formed the northern wall of the valley, the steep vertical face from which the long slope descended toward the settlement. His eyes moved across it in the habitual way of a man who looked at the world for things that needed addressing. He saw the line. It was subtle. He would have missed it if he hadn't been looking, or if the light had been different, or if some instinct, a residual trace of a conversation on a hillside in October, hadn't made him look more carefully than usual. A horizontal mark across the snowpack high on the cliff face, pale against the surrounding white. It ran for what appeared to be a considerable distance from one side of his field of vision toward the other. He stood very still and looked at it for a long time. Wind made ridges and dunes. Wind carved the surface of the snowpack into shapes that were consistent with its own direction and force. What he was looking at was not a wind feature. It was too horizontal, too regular, too precisely linear. It was the kind of mark that formed when a surface that had been continuous separated along a line of weakness into two distinct masses. He thought about the gravel under the topsoil. He thought about the stumps all pointing the same direction. He thought about a 64-year-old woman pressing her palm flat against the earth and showing him what she'd found. He thought about what he had said in Harwick's store. He finished the shoveling. He went inside and ate his noon meal. He said nothing to his wife about what he had seen because he was not yet certain what he had seen, and he did not want to be the man who had laughed at the mole woman and was now starting a panic over a shadow on a cliff face. But that night, after his wife was asleep and the storm continued to press against the shutters, he lay in the dark and thought about it. He thought about the angle of the fracture line and what it meant about the layers of snow beneath it, about what happens when enormous weight sits on a surface that can no longer support it. He had worked with metal long enough to understand failure points. He understood, in the way of someone whose profession was the study of how things held and how things gave way, what a fracture line in a snowpack represented. By the fifth day of the storm, he had made his decision. He waited until dark. The trail to the hilltop cabin was a different thing in the storm than it was in the dry autumn air. The path Marin had worn into the slope was buried under 4 feet of new snow, and Boyd climbed by feel and memory, his legs driving through drifts that reached his waist, in places his breath coming in heavy clouds that the cold wind took immediately. It took him nearly an hour to cover the distance he had climbed in 20 minutes in October. The cabin door opened before he reached the step. Marin stood in the lamplight with the bush at her knee, and she looked at him the way she always looked at things, carefully, directly, without the particular social performance of surprise. She stepped aside and let him in. He stood in the small front room, snow melting from his coat and boots onto the floor, and she waited for him to speak because she had always understood that the person who speaks first in a difficult conversation gives something away, and she had nothing to give away. He said he had seen the fracture line. She said she had seen it 2 days before. He said why had she not come down and told them? She looked at him then with an expression he had not seen on her before. Not anger, which he might have expected and could have managed, but something quieter and more final. The look of someone who has run out of a specific kind of hope and is now operating from a different premise entirely. She said she had come down 3 years before when she had first found the evidence in the ground. In July, when she had laid the notebook on Harwick's counter and explained everything she had found. And in the church a month ago, when she had stood up in front of the entire settlement and told them about Callum and the ice and the promise she had made. She said she had told them everything she knew as clearly as she knew how to tell it. And she asked him what he thought would happen if she came down now and said the fracture line had appeared and was growing. She asked him to think carefully about what the settlement would do with that information from her in the middle of the 5th night of a major storm. Boyd stood in the warmth of her cabin and had no answer for that. They went down together in the morning. The store was the gathering place in bad weather, the way it was always the gathering place, and a dozen men were inside warming themselves around the iron stove when Marin and Boyd came in. Harwick was behind the counter. Reverend Veitch was near the window with a book. The air smelled of wet wool and coffee and the particular closeness of people who have been indoors too long. The room went quiet when Marin walked in. She did not waste time on preamble. She described the fracture line, its position, its orientation, its length, the fact that it had appeared on the fourth day of the storm and had been widening since. She described what it meant in terms of the snowpack above the valley, the mass of accumulated wet snow that had been loading the cliff face since the storm began. She used plain language because she wanted to be understood and not because she was trying to be kind. When she finished, the room was silent. Harwick set down the tin cup he was holding. He said what she had described was snow doing what snow did in winter, settling, shifting, finding its level. He said they had had storms before. He said Alder Creek had been here for 12 years without a single incident of the kind she was describing. She turned to Boyd. He was standing near the stove. He had his arms folded. Every man in the room was looking at him because they had all heard that he had climbed the trail in the storm the previous night, and they understood that his answer to whatever unspoken question was in the air would matter more than anything Marin said. The room was very quiet. Boyd felt the weight of it, the specific social weight of a small community, watching one of its members make a choice that would define him in their eyes. He had seen the fracture line. He had recognized it. He had climbed the trail in a storm because some part of him, the part that worked with metal and understood failure points, had taken it seriously enough to go and look. He thought about what he had said at Christmas, the mole woman and her borrowed animal house. He thought about what it would cost to say in front of these men, in front of Harwick, that he believed her. He said it had looked like settling to him. He said it was probably wind drift. The sound of what he did not say was louder than what he said. Marin looked at him for a moment, not with anger, not with accusation, with the specific quiet recognition of someone who has just received confirmation of something they already knew. A door closing behind her, eyes the last available door. Reverend Veach spoke from his place near the window. He said fear was not faith. He said that in his experience, the kind of dread that Marin was describing came from grief and not from evidence. He said it without cruelty. He was not a cruel man. He simply believed what he said, and what he believed was more comfortable than the alternative. Marin turned and walked out of the store without another word. She did not look at Boyd again. She did not look back at all. She climbed the trail to the hillside in the driving snow, with her back straight and her pace steady, and when she reached the cabin, she went inside and closed the door and stood in the front room for a moment in the dark. Soot pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his head and stood there, and then she lit the lamp and went to work. The seventh day of the storm arrived like a held breath released. The snow stopped in the night, and the silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that it woke Marin from sleep at 4 in the morning. She lay in the dark and listened to the absence of sound and felt in her chest the specific weight of what the silence meant. She dressed in the dark. She put on every layer she owned. She took Callum's brass spyglass from the shelf where she kept it and went outside. The temperature had dropped below anything she had experienced since coming to Montana. The air bit at the exposed skin of her face immediately and without apology. The sky had torn open above the valley, and for the first time in a week, the stars were visible, brilliant and hard and very far away in the black sky, the kind of stars you only see when the atmosphere above them is perfectly still and perfectly cold. She climbed to the rock ledge beside the cabin, the natural platform of granite that jutted from the slope and gave her the best sight line up toward the cliffs. She raised the spyglass. She found the fracture line. It had been a crack when she first saw it on the fourth day of the storm. It had widened over the days since. Now she was looking at a gap, a dark shadow running horizontally across the face of the cliff, the shadow of a space that had not existed a week ago, a separation between the upper mass of snow and the layer below it that was visible even in the starlight. Below the gap, the snowpack bulged outward. The weight of 7 days of heavy accumulation had deformed the surface of the slope, pushing it out beyond its natural angle. The geometry of it was wrong in a way that she felt in her body before she could articulate it in words. Above the gap, the upper layer had tilted. It was almost imperceptible, the kind of change that only revealed itself if you had been looking at the same thing for days and knew what it had looked like before. But it was there. She lowered the spyglass. Below her, the settlement was waking up. She could see movement in the early light doors, opening figures emerging into the sudden, brilliant, cold people, blinking into the unexpected sunlight after a week of white and gray. Children ran into the snow that had buried the settlement, their voices rising up the hillside in the thin air. Men called to each other across the distance between buildings. The sounds of ordinary life resuming after constraint, the sounds of people who believed the worst was over. She stood on the ledge and felt something that she could not name, precisely a weight that was not fear, because fear would have been simpler and what she felt was not simple. It was the weight of knowing what she knew and looking at the people below and understanding that the distance between what she could see and what they could see was at this moment everything. Soot stood beside her rigid, his ears pressed flat against his skull, the fur along his spine raised in a ridge. He was not looking at the valley. He was looking up. The sound began in her bones before it reached her ears. It was not thunder. It was not like anything she had a word for. It was a vibration that traveled through the granite ledge beneath her boots and through the stone back wall of the cabin and through the frozen ground of the hillside, a sustained, deepening tremor that started below the threshold of hearing and built. She looked up. The snowpack on the cliff face was moving. Not falling, moving. The entire surface shifted downward in a single unified mass, the way a sheet of ice slides from a heated roof all at once, with a decision to it. For one impossible second, the mass hung in the upper air, still coherent, still a single thing. Then it broke. The sound that came then was beyond any sound she had heard in 64 years of living. It was not loud in the ordinary sense. It was total, a roar that came from everywhere at once, that replaced the air with itself that she felt in her teeth and her sternum, in the backs of her hands. The avalanche was a white wall taller than the tallest pines in the valley, and it was accelerating, and it was carrying everything in its path, trees ripped from the frozen ground, boulders lifted and thrown forward, the entire physical weight of a week of mountain winter moving at the speed of falling. Down in the valley, it took 3 seconds for the sound to reach the settlement. Boyd Calder was standing outside his smithy when the vibration reached him. He turned toward the mountain and looked up, and the part of him that worked metal and understood failure points, understood what he was seeing before his mind had formed the word. His legs were already moving when he grabbed the child nearest to him, a boy of perhaps 7, a child he didn't even recognize in the moment, belonging to a family he would have to think to name, and began running toward the high ground, toward the only high ground anywhere near the valley, toward the hillside, toward the trail that led to the cabin everyone had spent 2 months calling foolish. He was shouting as he ran. The word he shouted was up, go up. The hillside, go up. The word spread. It spread the way panic spreads in a small settlement, instantly, totally without the possibility of not hearing it once it had started. Cabin doors flew open. Men emerged and looked up, and their bodies understood before their minds did. Women seized children. Some people ran toward the creek, which was the wrong direction, and some people ran in circles because the wrong direction and the right direction looked the same when everything was happening at once. Nettie Crane was inside her cabin when the sound reached her. She had been standing near the door. She had been standing near the door since the morning of the 6th day of the storm, when she had heard through a neighbor that Marin had come down from the hillside and gone to Harwick's store and said something about a fracture line that nobody had believed. Since that morning, Nettie had found reasons to stay near the door. To keep her coat on a hook she could reach in 3 steps. To keep the bundle, she had quietly assembled 2 blankets, a canvas sack, dried food from the back of the pantry on the floor beside the door rather than in the cupboard where it normally lived. She heard the roar begin, and her body moved before she had decided to move. She had both children in her arms before the sound had fully registered as what it was. She had the bundle in her hand before she reached the door. She kicked the door open and ran for the trail, and she was already on the lower slope, already climbing, when the white wall reached the valley floor. Alder Creek disappeared in 30 seconds. Marin watched it from the ledge. She watched the wave of snow and debris move through the settlement the way a hand moves through dry sand, effortlessly, completely, without the settlement offering any meaningful resistance to the force applied against it. Buildings that had stood for 12 years vanished. The general store that Harwick had built and stocked and protected both collapsed inward without drama. The church that Reverend Veitch had preached unfolded and was carried forward. The smithy, the cabins, the fences, and the paths between them, and the small visible accumulations of 12 years of community, all of it erased in less than the time it took to draw a breath. Then the roar stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. The pre-dawn silence had been the silence of held breath. This silence was the silence of aftermath, total ringing the silence of a landscape that has just been made new and has not yet figured out what to do next. A cloud of snow dust rose above the valley in the still air, glittering in the early light, catching the sun that had just appeared above the eastern ridge. Where Alder Creek had been, there was a white field of churned snow and shattered timber that extended from one side of the valley floor to the other. The survivors came up the trail in ones and twos and then in larger groups. Marin watched them come. They emerged from the lower sections of the slope, where the avalanche had not reached, from the upper edges of the valley where people had managed to run before the wall arrived, from places of accidental shelter. Some were carrying children. Some were carrying nothing at all, having left their homes with only what they were wearing. Some were bleeding from cuts they hadn't noticed yet because the cold and the shock had taken precedence over pain. Boyd Calder was near the front. He was still carrying the child he had grabbed from the settlement street, the boy's arms locked around his neck. His face showed what happens to a person when the worst possible version of the thing they dismissed becomes real in front of them. Not guilt yet, because guilt requires the emotional bandwidth that shock absorbs, but the specific blankness of a man who is in the process of understanding what he has done and has not yet had the space to feel it. Behind him came Harwick Dunn, bareheaded in the cold, moving in the dazed, deliberate way of someone operating on the last functional layer of their cognition. Behind Harwick came a stream of faces, men and women and children, 60 people reduced in 30 seconds to 37, and then more coming from the edges of the valley as the minutes passed, and finally the count reached 43 and stopped. They came up the trail in silence or in the sounds of crying children and labored breathing. They came to the cabin on the hill, the cabin that everyone had called foolish, the cabin that looked like a fold in the mountain because it had been built to look like a fold in the mountain by a woman who understood why that mattered. Marin stood in the doorway. She looked at 43 faces. She did not speak immediately. She let herself see them, really see them the way she saw everything, without the screen of what she had expected or hoped or feared. They were cold and hurt and frightened and alive, which was better than the alternative. And the alternative had just occurred to approximately a third of the settlement's population. Then she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. That was all. One by one, and then in groups, they came through the door, tracking snow across the floor she had laid, filling the space she had built for one person with the weight of 43. She directed the children toward the hearth and the wounded toward the corner where she kept the medical kit, and everyone else toward the walls where they could sit against the stone and begin the slow process of becoming warm again. Nettie came through the door carrying both her children at once, the canvas bundle still somehow in her hand. She looked at Marin across the crowded room, and neither woman spoke. Marin nodded once. Nettie nodded back. Boyd Calder came in last after he had made a final pass along the lower trail to confirm that no one else was coming. He set the child he was carrying down near the fire and stood in the middle of the room and looked around at what had held the warmth, the shelves of supplies visible through the cellar hatch that Marin had left open, the structure of a place that had been built for exactly this and that had held against the same force that had erased everything below. He looked at Marin. His face had passed through shock and was arriving at something on the other side of it, something that had no comfortable name, the recognition of a debt that exists in a register beyond what can be repaid. "You told us," he said. His voice was very quiet. Marin had been reaching for blankets from the storage chest along the wall. She did not stop what she was doing. She did not look at him. She took the blankets and began passing them to the people nearest the door. The first thing Marin did after the last person came through the door was take inventory. Not of the people. Boyd had done that on the trail, counting as they climbed, and the number was 43. She took inventory of what she had and what 43 people would require of it, because that was the next problem. And the next problem was the one that needed her attention now that the immediate emergency had resolved itself into something she could work with. She did the arithmetic in her head while she moved through the crowded cabin, distributing blankets and directing people away from the drafty corners and toward the stone interior walls that held the fire's warmth most efficiently. The cellar held what it held. The winter outside held what it held. The question between those two facts was how long the first would last against the second, and whether that duration was sufficient. When she had a number she was confident in, she went to find Boyd. He was near the back wall, helping a miner named Prescott reset the man's shoulder, which had been dislocated in the run up the hill. Prescott had gone white and was not looking at his arm. Boyd was working quickly and, without ceremony, the way someone works when they know how to do a thing and understand that hesitation makes it worse. Marin waited until the shoulder was back in its socket and Prescott had been given something to grip while he processed the aftermath. Then she touched Boyd's arm and led him to the cellar hatch. She lifted the hatch and held her lantern down into the space below, and Boyd looked at the shelves. He was quiet for a long time. She said if we stretch it carefully. She had calculated it twice and she gave him the number, and he closed his eyes briefly and then opened them again and looked at the shelves with the expression of a man accepting a set of conditions he cannot alter. 3 weeks, he said. She said yes. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he straightened and looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her directly since he had spoken in Harwick's store, and the looking cost him something visible. I need to say something to you, he said. She said later. Right now, she needed him to help her manage the room because 43 people in a space built for one person was a logistical problem that required immediate attention, and she had a list of things that needed doing before the temperature dropped further. Boyd took the list. The second thing that happened, not long after people had been situated, and the immediate shock had begun to settle into the heavier and more durable weight of comprehension, was Harwick Dunn standing up. He stood up in the middle of the crowded room with the expression of a man who is accustomed to being the person in any gathering who addresses problems, who organizes responses, who takes the chair because he has always taken the chair and the room has always let him. He said they needed to organize. He said that 43 people, limited supplies, and unknown duration that required management. He said he was willing to take that responsibility. The room went quiet in the particular way of rooms where something important is about to be decided. Willa Foss spoke from her place near the hearth before anyone else had found words. She was 74 years old, the oldest person in the settlement, a woman who had come to Montana with her husband when the territory was still a territory and had outlived the territory and the husband and 4 of the 5 children she had raised in various settlements across the western mountains. She was small and had the stillness of someone who had long since stopped spending energy on things that didn't require it. She said, Harwick, sit down. She did not raise her voice. She did not elaborate. She simply looked at Harwick Dunn with the specific composure of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know exactly what was happening and to have a clear opinion about what should happen next. She said, Ba'e Yuchungta Sung. Let her keep us alive a little longer. Harwick's mouth opened and then closed. He looked around the room for the support that had always been available to him in the store downstairs in the settlement below. The faces that looked back at him were not hostile. They were simply not his anymore, in the way that authority that depends on control of resources stops being authority when the resources change hands. He sat down. He sat down against the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw set and looked at the floor with the expression of a man beginning the long and uncomfortable work of reconsidering something he had built his self-understanding around. Marin did not comment on any of this. She was already moving. The days took on a rhythm. It was not a comfortable rhythm. Nothing about 43 people living in a space built for one person was comfortable, and Marin did not waste energy pretending otherwise. But it was a functional rhythm because function was what the situation required, and function was what she knew how to build. Boyd and 4 other men went out each morning at first light to cut firewood from the trees above the ridgeline. The avalanche had taken the valley timber, but the upper slope trees had survived buried to their midpoints. But standing, and the men worked in brutal cold for 2 hours each morning and came back with what they could carry. It was not enough. It was never quite enough, but it was sufficient to keep the fire at a level that kept the stone walls warm and kept the children from the cold that would otherwise be dangerous. Nettie Crane managed the food distribution. This was not assigned to her. It evolved the way things evolve in constrained situations, from a combination of capability and inclination, and the recognition by the people around her that she was doing it well. She measured each portion with a small tin cup, the same amount, the same for every person in the room, regardless of size or status, or how loudly they felt they deserved more. She kept a count in her head and adjusted the projections as the stores were drawn down, and she and Marin talked each evening about where they stood. They talked about it efficiently in the way of people who understood the same things and didn't need to perform their understanding for each other. Willa Foss took the children. She did this without discussion, settling herself each day near the fire with whatever children needed managing, and managing them the way she managed everything with the patient authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. She told them stories, not invented ones, but true ones. Stories of people who had survived difficult things by continuing to do what needed doing when what needed doing was hard. She told the stories in a quiet and even voice that became over the days the specific sound of reassurance. Reassurance in that crowded room, the sound that meant things were bad and someone who knew how bad was not panicking. The children slept near the fire under blankets. The adults slept in shifts against the walls. The days were short and the nights were very long, and the cold outside was a presence in the room in the way that it is a presence when the walls between you and it are measured in stone rather than in the distance of ordinary winter. Harwick Dunn said nothing for 3 days. On the fourth day in the evening, after the day's meal had been distributed and most of the room had settled into the exhausted quiet that passed for rest, he moved from his place against the wall to where Marin was sitting near the cellar hatch, reviewing what remained on the shelves. He sat beside her. He did not speak immediately. When he did speak, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. The particular quality of a voice from which the performance has been removed because the performer has run out of energy to perform. He said he had a list of what every household in the settlement had stored before the storm. Every item he had sold to every family in the past 2 years, he kept records as any storekeeper kept records. And he carried the knowledge of those records in his head, as well as in the ledger that was now buried under 20 feet of compacted snow and debris. He said the Agnes Birch cabin on the east side of the settlement had been one of the highest lying structures. The roof might be partially exposed above the snow. Agnes had bought 2 crates of canned goods in October and a 50-pound sack of flour. If the attic was intact, those supplies might be reachable. He named 4 other properties with similar possibilities: the location, the stored goods, the structural characteristics that might have left them accessible. He provided this information without preamble and without the framing of an apology or a concession. He simply gave her what he had because what he had was the only thing of value he could offer to the situation. She listened to all of it. Then she said she would talk to Boyd in the morning. Harwick nodded and returned to his place against the wall. The salvage operations began the following day. Boyd organized it. He chose the men carefully, those with the physical capacity and the temperament, for the kind of work that required moving slowly across unstable terrain where one wrong step meant disappearing into a void in the compacted debris. They roped themselves together in a line and moved down the slope from the cabin, using Boyd's axe handle as a probe testing the surface before committing weight, working in the specific, careful way of men who understood that the speed of the work was less important than the continuation of the workers. The first 2 days produced less than they hoped and more than they feared. The Agnes Birch attic was partially accessible. Boyd broke through the roof with his axe, and they recovered the canned goods in the flour damp but usable. 2 other properties yielded smaller amounts. One was crushed completely, its contents pulverized and irretrievable. The supplies pushed their calculation forward by several days. On the 3rd day of the salvage work, Cresswell Shaw went through. He was on the far end of the rope line probing a section of debris near what had been the center of the settlement when the surface gave way without warning. The snowpack he had been standing on was a bridge over a collapsed structure, and when it went all at once. He dropped 6 feet into a void of dark space and shattered timber, the rope pulling taut against the strain as the men above scrambled for purchase. They held him, but the rope had caught on a jagged edge of broken beam at the lip of the hole, and the friction made it impossible to pull him back through the gap. He was conscious they could hear him below, his voice tight with pain, and the particular restraint of a man trying not to give the full extent of what he was feeling, but his left leg was pinned beneath a section of collapsed roofing, and he could not free it himself. The gap in the debris was too narrow for any of the men on the surface to pass through. Boyd sent the youngest man back to the cabin at a run. Marin came to the edge of the hole and knelt in the snow and looked down into the dark. She could see Cresswell's face, gray pale in the reflected light, angled up toward her. She asked him where the beam was and how far he was from the floor of the void. He told her, his voice controlled in a way that cost him something visible even from above. She assessed the gap. She stood and looked at Nettie, who had come with her from the cabin. Nettie was already looking at the gap. Then she looked at Marin. Then she looked back at the gap. She said she could fit. Her husband Dex Crane was standing at the rope line with the other men. He had come back to the settlement from the mine on the upper ridge on the second day after the avalanche, having sheltered in the mine entrance through the event and climbed down to find his family when the sky cleared. He had said very little since. When he looked at Nettie now, his face carried the complicated arithmetic of a man who knows what his wife is about to do and knows there is no reasonable argument against it that doesn't cost him more than the alternative. Nettie did not wait for anyone to agree or disagree. She kissed her children who were standing at the edge of the group. She told them she would be back before supper. She said it in the matter-of-fact tone that told them it was true and not just a thing said to reassure them, because Nettie Crane's children knew the difference. Then she let Marin tie the rope around her under her arms, and she went over the edge. The descent was slower than it looked. The walls of the void were irregular ice and splintered wood and packed debris, and she had to work her way down carefully, using her feet against the walls to control the rate, letting herself down in increments that the men above could manage on the rope. It took several minutes that felt considerably longer than several minutes. She reached the floor of the void and oriented herself by the small amount of light coming through the gap above. Cresswell Shaw was lying on his back, with his left leg pinned under a section of timber that was part of a collapsed interior wall. He looked at her with the expression of a man who is holding himself very carefully together because he understands that the alternative is not useful. She said she needed him to stay still. She worked the timber by feel, getting her hands under the section that was bearing the weight on his leg, testing the geometry of it. It was heavy enough that moving it required her to brace her back against the void wall and push with her legs, a slow and effortful process that produced almost no visible movement for the first several attempts. On the fourth attempt, the timber shifted. It moved 2 inches, which was enough. Cresswell pulled his leg clear in a movement that produced a sound she would remember for a long time, the sound of someone not screaming when everything in their body wanted to. She checked the leg with her hands, no break in the bone, though she couldn't be certain of anything less than that. She got the rope under his arms in the configuration that Boyd had described and tugged it 3 times in the signal they had agreed on. The men above began to pull. Getting him through the gap took time and coordination, and the willingness of Cresswell Shaw to tolerate what the process required of him, which was considerable. She guided him from below until he was through the worst of it, and then the rope took him the rest of the way. When they lowered the rope again, she tied it under her own arms and came up. Her hands were shaking when she reached the surface. The cold of the void had settled into her in a way that the surface cold had not something deeper than skin temperature, something in the muscle itself. She stood on her own feet and did not ask for help, and did not accept the arm that Dex offered, except to squeeze his hand once briefly before she released it and turned toward the cabin. Cresswell Shaw sat near the fire that evening with his leg wrapped in cloth from the medical kit. He watched Nettie across the room where she was portioning the evening meal with the same careful attention she brought to everything. He said, after a long silence, "You went down there for me." She said without looking up, "We keep each other alive, that's all." He turned back to the fire. He did not speak again for a while, but his face had changed in the way that faces change when someone has received something they cannot find words for. By the end of the second week, the salvage operations had extended the food supply to somewhere between 4 and 5 weeks. This was not comfortable because no one knew when the weather would allow travel out of the valley, and no one knew what the valley would look like when they finally descended into it. But it was enough to stop counting hours and start counting days, which was a different and more manageable kind of arithmetic. On the morning of the 26th day, Marin climbed to the rock ledge before dawn. She did this every morning, had done it every morning since the avalanche, because the habit of watching the mountain had preceded the emergency, and she saw no reason to abandon it now. She raised Callum's spyglass and moved it across the cliff face with the slow attention she always brought to this. She found the new line without looking for it. It was above the original fracture point, higher on the cliff face, running at a different angle, cutting across a section of the upper slope that she had not been watching as closely because the original fracture had resolved and the snowpack in that area had seemed to stabilize. This was a different crack in a different location, and its orientation told her something that she needed a moment of stillness to fully process. She lowered the spyglass. If the original fracture had released, it would have come down into the valley. That slide path ran below the cabin and to the west of it. It was the path she had built against. This new fracture was above and behind the cabin. If it released, the slide path ran directly across the hillside, directly through the structure that 43 people were sleeping inside. She sat down on the cold granite. The rock was below freezing immediately and thoroughly. She felt it through the layers of her clothing and did not move. The spyglass hung from her hand at her side. She had built the cabin against the shape of the threat she had understood. She had done everything she could see to do with the knowledge she had. She had been right about the danger and right about the preparation and right about all of it, and now the mountain had produced a danger she had not seen coming from a direction she had not built against, and 43 people were asleep in the structure below her. Soot pressed his muzzle against her hand. She spoke very quietly to no one in particular, and to Callum specifically. She said she did not know what to do. The wind moved across the ridge and took the words away. She sat there for what she estimated was less than a minute, though it felt longer. Then she stood up. She looked at the new fracture through the spyglass again. She measured it against the features around it and tried to estimate how long it had been there and how fast it was opening. She looked at the temperature which she had been reading from the small instrument she kept outside the cabin door. She looked at the sky above the ridgeline, which was clear and still and very cold. Then she looked at the slope above the cabin, and she began to think. She found Boyd inside at the end of the morning's woodcutting detail. She did not tell him what she had found while others were listening. She took him to the ledge and showed him the fracture through the spyglass and let him look at it without commentary until he had seen what he needed to see. His color changed when he understood the angle. He said, "How long?" She said she didn't know. Days, possibly less. He looked at the slope above the cabin. He was silent for a long time, the silence of a man who is working through something that doesn't resolve easily. Then he said, "We can't move 43 people. Not in this cold, not with the children, not with the valley buried." She said she knew. She walked around to the back of the cabin and stood looking up the slope. Boyd followed her. She pointed at the outcropping of granite that jutted from the hillside approximately 30 meters above the cabin, a solid shelf of exposed rock angled outward from the mountain, wide enough to serve as what she was thinking about if you added to its natural geometry. She explained what she was thinking. Boyd listened. He was a man who understood force and angles and what happened when a large mass encountered an object placed across its path. She was not describing a guarantee, she was describing a reduction of odds, a modification of geometry that might change where the worst of the force went and might not. That would require a significant amount of work in the available time and might not be enough even if they completed it. But it was what was available. Boyd looked at the outcropping. He looked at the slope above it. He said, "How many trees?" She gave him the number and the specifications and the placement. She said they had to start immediately. He walked back into the cabin. Within 10 minutes, every man in the cabin who could hold an axe was outside. They worked through what remained of that day and through the full length of the next cutting trees on the upper slope and dragging them downhill through snow that reached their chests in places of brutal and continuous effort that produced in the men who did it a quality of exhausted silence. Not the silence of people who had stopped thinking, but the silence of people who had reduced themselves to the immediate physical task, because reducing yourself to the immediate physical task was the only way to continue doing it. Harwick Dunn came out on the morning of the first day. He did not speak. He picked up an axe and walked to the slope. His hands were not hands that had held axes for any sustained period in the past 20 years. They blistered in the first hour. By the end of the first day, the blisters had opened and the gloves were stained. He did not mention it. He did not stop. He came back the second day and worked until the work was finished. No one thanked him. No one needed to. What he was doing was visible to everyone who saw it, and what it meant was visible to everyone who had been in the settlement long enough to know what Harwick Dunn's hands normally looked like. The rearing construction was rough and functional and completed by the end of the second day. It rose 8 feet against the granite shelf, angled outward at the geometry Marin had calculated, braced with cross members and packed with snow until it was solid enough to resist the initial impact of whatever came down the slope. It was not beautiful. It was not what she would have built if she had months and ideal materials. But it was sound in the way that things built from necessity and muscle and desperation are sometimes sound. That night, 43 people lay in the cabin and did not sleep. Willa Foss sat near the fire and told stories as she had been doing for days. But the stories she told that night were different, longer and slower. The stories of people who had waited through long nights for mornings that were uncertain. The children listened, and some of them slept, and some of them didn't, and the adults who were awake listened too, in the way that adults listen to stories meant for children, when the stories are actually about something the adults need more than the children do. Marin sat by the fire and did not close her eyes. She listened to the mountain. She had been listening to it for 3 years in the ground and the trees and the gravel under the topsoil and the stumps that pointed all the same direction. She had learned its vocabulary of warning. She sat by the fire in the dark and listened for the next word. The mountain was quiet. At some point in the deepest part of the night, she became aware that the temperature had changed. It was subtle, a matter of a few degrees, but she had been monitoring temperature with the attention she gave to all variables that mattered, and she felt the change before the instrument outside would have registered it. The quality of the cold through the cabin walls was different, less absolute. Something in the atmosphere above them had shifted in the night, some condition that she had been tracking in the accumulation of small observations she made every day. She went outside before dawn. The air was still cold, but it was different, cold wet rather than dry, the kind of cold that existed above a certain threshold, the kind that changed what happened in snowpack. She stood in the dark for a moment and felt it on her face. Then she climbed to the ledge with the spyglass. The fracture was still there. It had not widened overnight. She measured it against the reference points she had been using and confirmed what she was seeing: no change. The temperature increase, however slight, had been enough to change the chemistry of the layers below the fracture, encouraging them to bond rather than to shear. The slide that had been building had stalled, not because the danger was gone, but because the specific conditions required for it to move had been interrupted by a shift in temperature that might hold and might not. She watched it for a long time. Boyd appeared beside her at some point, and she handed him the spyglass without speaking, and he looked, and after a while he lowered the glass. He said it might not go. She said, but the barrier was still worth building. He looked at her. After everything that had passed between them, the store, the fracture line, what he had said and not said, and chosen and not chosen. He looked at her in the early light with the expression of someone who has finished calculating something and arrived at a number that requires them to revise a great deal of what came before. Marin said, help me get the fire going before everyone wakes up. It'll be a cold morning. They went back inside. Reverend Vage found Marin near the end of the second week, when most of the survivors had begun to move toward the daylight hours, working the salvage, gathering wood, doing the things that needed doing, and the cabin was quiet in the afternoons. He sat down near her with none of the posture of the pulpit, none of the managed resonance she had heard in his voice every Sunday. He said, I owe you something. She waited. He said, I used my position to make things harder for you. I had a platform, and I used it against someone who was trying to warn us, and I dressed it in language that sounded like principle and wasn't. She looked at the fire. He said, I don't expect that to change what was done. I needed to say it. She said, snow doesn't care what anyone believes, Reverend. He said, no, it doesn't. They sat in silence for a while. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one, and honest silences were rarer and more valuable than their comfortable counterparts. When spring finally came, it came slowly at first, then all at once, the way springs come in the Mountain West, tentative, and then committed, the temperature rising in increments until the snow on the lower slopes began to run in thin streams that grew into channels, and then into the full voice of the creek, finding its way back to itself under the ice. The valley was a different thing when the snow pulled back from it. The settlement was gone, of course. That was known and expected, and the survivors had been preparing themselves for the reality of it through the weeks in the cabin. But the valley itself, the land, the shape of the ground, the creek's path through it had been altered by the force that had moved through it. New contours, new deposits, new landforms that had not existed before January. Boyd spent several days walking the changed terrain with a measuring rope and a notebook, the same activity Marin had been doing 3 years before on the hillside, but pointed downward instead of up. He took measurements. He drew diagrams. He consulted with the men who had building experience about what the new topography offered. The conclusion he arrived at, which was the conclusion he should have arrived at 3 years earlier, if he had been willing to listen, was that the floor of the valley was not where you built a settlement. Not in this particular valley with these particular ridges and this particular relationship between slope angle and snowpack accumulation. The lower slopes of the hillside above the valley floor below the line of maximum avalanche risk were where you built. Nettie and Dex Crane began their new home on a gentle slope above the east bank of the creek. The foundation went deep into the hillside. The back wall was stone. The roof beams were oversized. It was not a beautiful house in the way of houses built without constraints. It was a house built by people who had learned something and intended to keep what they had learned in the structure permanently. Marin helped them raise the first roof beam. She positioned the diagonal bracing into the stone wall and showed Dex how to seat it so it would carry more than its own weight, and Dex watched her hands and learned what she was showing him. Nettie stood in the unfinished doorway and watched Marin work. The bag of nails was not mentioned. The dark trail and the whispered warning, and the risk that Nettie had taken and taken alone, those things were between them in the room without being spoken, the way important things between people who understand each other often exist without needing to be made explicit. Harwick Dunn built his new store on a flat section of the lower hillside above the creek but below the identified risk zone in the position that Boyd had marked as appropriate. He laid a deeper foundation than any structure he had previously built. The walls were thicker than necessary for a general store in ordinary circumstances, but he had arrived at a new definition of ordinary circumstances. The shelf nearest the door held more hardware than the store needed to carry nails and hinges and wire, and the specific items that had been unavailable to a woman building a cabin on a hillside in October of 1912, more than the trade of a settlement this size could justify. He restocked it whenever it was drawn down. He never explained this to anyone. No one asked him to explain it. On an evening in the middle of July, Marin climbed to the rock ledge and stood with her back to the cabin and looked at what the valley had become. Below her, the sounds of construction moved through the late afternoon air, hammers and saws, and the calling of voices across the slope, the sounds of a community rebuilding itself in a configuration that made sense for the terrain it occupied. New roof lines appeared against the hillside at intervals, each one at a different elevation than it would have been the previous autumn. Stone foundations, oversized beams, the deliberate geometry of structures built by people who had learned something specific about the relationship between mountains and the things people built near them. Soot lay at her feet. His muzzle had gone entirely white in the months since the winter, and he moved more slowly than he had in the autumn, but he was there as he had always been there, pressing his warmth against her boots. She held Callum's spyglass in her hand. She did not raise it to look at the cliff face above the valley. She knew what was there, and she would look tomorrow morning as she looked every morning with the same patient attention she had brought to it for 3 years. Tonight, she did not need the glass for that. She looked at the new roof lines on the hillside. She looked at the smoke beginning to rise from new chimneys as the evening cooled. She looked at the shape of what was being built, not what had been lost, but what had been learned made permanent in stone and timber by people who had paid the tuition for that education and intended to keep the knowledge somewhere it couldn't be forgotten. She thought about Callum. Not the morning on the river, not the ice, though. That was always there, the foundation of everything. The moment that had made her who she had become in the years since. She thought about the evenings before that, the ordinary evenings, the man lacing his boots at the kitchen table, and the fire and the particular quality of a life built alongside another person, the warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. She thought about what he would have made of all of it. She thought he would have said, "I told you the view was better up here." She almost smiled. She looked at the spyglass in her hand, brass worn smooth along the barrel from decades of handling the lens ground by someone she would never know for a purpose that had been his and had become hers. She turned it once in her hand, then she put it in her coat pocket where it always lived, where it would be tomorrow morning when she needed it again. She looked out at the valley for another moment, at the hammers still going in the last of the light, at the children visible on the lower slope, small figures moving between the new structures in the way of children who have not yet learned to be afraid of mountains and probably shouldn't. She said it quietly, not to Soot and not to Callum, and not to the valley below, to no one, and to all of it at once. She said, "Now they can see it." Soot lifted his head at the sound of her voice. The evening light moved across the new settlement and painted it gold and then amber, and then the deep, serious purple that came when the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the mountains held the last of it. She stayed until the light was gone. Then she picked up the toolbox she had brought with her to the ledge, because there were still things that needed building, and she walked back toward the cabin, and the sound of hammers followed her as long as the light lasted.